Here are 27 forgotten veggies that grandparents grew to survive the Great Depression. Lamb's quarters. When gardens ran empty and store shelves stayed bare during the Great Depression, lamb's quarters saved the day. A weed to some, but a lifeline to others. This wild green flourished in forgotten corners of farms and alleyways. Our grandparents, desperate for food back in the day, learned to recognize its jagged leaves, plucking them to boil into soups, fry with lard, or eat fresh in salads. Rich in vitamins A and C, calcium and iron, it offered the nutrients malnourished bodies craved. Best of all, it grew where other crops failed. Dry soil, compacted ground, even cracks in sidewalks. Unlike spinach, it didn't bolt in the summer heat, stretching tall when other greens withered. It was free. It was everywhere. It was survival in a time when every meal mattered. Now, while lamb's quarters fed struggling families straight from the ground, some households looked upward toward a vegetable that climbed, curled, and kept producing through the long, hot summers of the 1930s. Kentucky Wonder Pole beans. They climbed, they twisted, they thrived. Kentucky Wonder Pole beans weren't just any bean. They were the kind that kept families from starving. Our grandparents planted them against fence posts, porch railings, or makeshift trellises, letting them reach for the sky, offering weeks of fresh pods and months of dried beans. A single planting could yield bushels. Feeding families well into winter, high in protein, fiber, and iron, they provided the energy needed for long days of labor, especially when work was scarce. Cooked slow with a ham hock or thrown into stews, they turned into rich, hearty meals that stretched for days. Cooks saved every pod, drying them on strings hung across kitchens, leather breeches they called them. When times got hard in the Great Depression, they'd pluck a handful, boil them back to life, and serve a meal that tasted of hope. But while pole beans flourished in the warmth of summer, families needed something reliable when the frost set in, a vegetable that could handle the cold, grow beneath the soil, and last long into the harsh winters of the 1930s. Turnips. Nothing went to waste. The bulb, the leaves, even the skin, every part of a turnip found its way to the table. Our grandparents prized them for their toughness. They grew in cold weather, surviving frosts that killed weaker crops. With just a patch of dirt and a handful of seeds, a family could eat for months. Mashed, roasted, stewed. Turnips replaced potatoes when spuds ran short. The greens, cooked down with bacon grease or salt pork, provided iron and vitamins when fresh vegetables were scarce. Pickled, they could last all winter. No refrigeration. No problem. Kept in root cellars, buried in sand, or simply stored in a cool shed, they endured when everything else rotted away. Farmers fed them to livestock, but smart families knew better. Turnips weren't just feed, they were food, and good food at that. In the depths of economic collapse, turnips kept many from going hungry. Yet, while turnips filled bellies, something was still missing. When food shortages stretched into another brutal winter, people longed for a vegetable that stood tall and strong, its deep green leaves packed with the kind of nourishment that could keep families going. Collard greens. Bitter, tough, and built for survival. Collard greens weren't just food, they were a lifeline. In the South, they stood tall through winter, their broad leaves defying the frost. Rich in vitamins K, A, and C, packed with fiber and calcium, they kept bones strong and bodies fed when nutrition was scarce. Our grandparents boiled them for hours with ham bones or fatback, softening them into tender, smoky goodness. Their pot liquor, as they called it, so rich in nutrients it was sipped straight from the bowl. Unlike lettuce or spinach, they didn't spoil quickly. A basket of collards could last days without refrigeration, making them a Depression-era dream. People grew them in backyard patches, roadside ditches, anywhere seeds could take hold. When the cupboards were empty and store lines stretched for blocks, collards kept families alive. But survival wasn't just about fresh greens. When people needed a vegetable that could sit in storage for months, providing meals deep into the coldest days, they turned to something round, dense, and built to last. Danish ballhead cabbage. Round, dense, and nearly indestructible, Danish ballhead cabbage was the workhorse of the Great Depression. With thick, tightly packed leaves, it resisted frost, bugs, and rot, outlasting almost every other vegetable in the garden. Our grandparents swore by it. A single head could feed a household for days, stretching into soups, stews, and fried patties. Fermented into sauerkraut, it lasted months, supplying vital vitamin C in the depths of winter. Raw, it added crunch to sandwiches and slaws. Boiled, it turned buttery soft. Pickled, it became a tangy treat. Stored in cool cellars or packed in straw, it stayed fresh long after other crops had withered. In hard times, a good cabbage patch was better than money in the bank, providing sustenance when every penny counted. And when even cabbage was gone, families needed something else, something that could be roasted, mashed, or sliced into thin, crispy chips. A vegetable that could stretch a meal and bring warmth to the table, even on the bleakest days of the 1930s. Cardoon. In the lean years of the 1930s, families had to make the most of what grew easily, and cardoon was one of those forgotten heroes. A cousin of the artichoke, its tall, spiky stalks looked uninviting, but our grandparents knew better. When boiled or braised, cardoon softened into a rich, nutty vegetable, packed with fiber, potassium, and vitamin C. It thrived in dry conditions, resisting pests and drought, exactly what struggling families needed. With little effort, it provided meals when gardens produced little else. Many cooked it with cheese or in stews, stretching what little they had into something hearty and filling. Unlike potatoes or grains, it was rarely stolen from gardens because few knew its value. While cardoon wasn't the easiest vegetable to prepare, those who had it never went hungry. Of course, survival meant having something that could endure extreme heat. For that, people turned to a green unlike any other, a vine that flourished under the scorching summer sun, Malabar spinach. Traditional greens wilted in the heat, but Malabar spinach thrived. This climbing vine with its thick, glossy leaves was a godsend in the Great Depression, especially for families in the South. Unlike regular spinach, which bolted quickly, Malabar spinach grew endlessly in hot, humid conditions, producing vitamin-rich leaves for months. It was full of iron, calcium, and vitamin A, making it one of the most nutritious greens available during the 1930s. Its slightly slippery texture made it perfect for thickening stews, a trick that stretched limited ingredients into more filling meals. Families could grow it along fences, allowing it to climb and produce food in even the smallest backyard gardens. Without refrigeration, fresh greens spoiled quickly, but Malabar spinach could be picked as needed. But while Malabar spinach provided greens in the heat, families also needed vegetables that could withstand the salty winds of coastal towns. That's where a forgotten sea vegetable stepped in: sea kale. Sea kale wasn't just for coastal families. It was a survival crop that could grow in sandy, wind-blown soil where few vegetables thrived. Its thick blue-green leaves were packed with vitamin C and fiber, keeping scurvy at bay when fresh fruit was scarce. Our grandparents knew how to use every part of the plant. In the spring, tender shoots were eaten like asparagus. Later in the season, the broad leaves were cooked like collard greens. The roots, which stored well through winter, added another layer of sustenance. Best of all, sea kale was a perennial. It came back year after year without replanting. Those who cultivated it always had a reliable food source, even when money was tight. Yet, as useful as sea kale was, families also needed root crops, ones that could stay hidden underground, safe from frost and prying hands. And few were as abundant or resilient as this knobby, underestimated tuber: Jerusalem artichokes. Despite their name, Jerusalem artichokes weren't from Jerusalem and weren't true artichokes. But what they lacked in identity, they made up for in survival. These knobby, sunflower-related tubers were a secret weapon during the Great Depression. They grew anywhere, in poor soil, in frost, even with neglect. Unlike potatoes, which required careful storage, Jerusalem artichokes could be left in the ground all winter and dug up as needed, providing an always available food source. Their nutty, slightly sweet flavor worked well in soups, mashed dishes, or even roasted. High in inulin, they helped people feel full longer, an invaluable trait when food was scarce. Some families even ground them into flour when wheat was out of reach. Jerusalem artichokes were a Depression-era powerhouse, but they weren't the only forgotten root crop. There was another, one so sweet and starchy that it could even replace sugar in hard times. Skirret. When sugar was a luxury and hunger was a daily battle, skirret was a lifesaver. This nearly forgotten root vegetable was once a staple, but by the time of the Great Depression, it had already faded from most gardens. Those who still knew its value, however, reaped the benefits. Skirret's long, slender roots were naturally sweet, making them a rare treat when refined sugar was out of reach. Families boiled, roasted, or mashed them into soups and puddings, adding a starchy richness to meals. Unlike potatoes, which needed careful storage, skirret grew in clusters, producing multiple edible roots per plant. Best of all, it thrived in cold weather and poor soil, making it an ideal crop when gardens were struggling. Food had to be filling, but it also had to last. Some vegetables weren't just for eating. They were for preserving, fermenting, and making meals stretch far beyond their harvest. Dandelion. It grew everywhere, roadsides, fields, even in the cracks of sidewalks. While many saw dandelions as weeds, our grandparents saw them as a lifeline. During the Great Depression, these yellow-flowered plants became a dependable source of free food when grocery store shelves were empty. The vitamin-rich leaves were eaten raw in the salads or boiled to remove their bitterness. The roots were roasted and ground into a coffee substitute, giving families an alternative when real coffee was a luxury. Even the flowers had value, turned into fritters, syrups, or dandelion wine. No part of the plant was wasted. Dandelions weren't just survival food. They were resilience, growing wild and waiting to be used by those who knew their worth. While dandelions could be foraged in the wild, families also needed something more predictable, leafy greens that thrived even in poor soil and could produce food for months on end. Swiss chard. Swiss chard was a nutritional powerhouse in Depression-era gardens. Unlike spinach, which struggled in heat, Swiss chard could produce food from spring to frost, ensuring families had fresh greens throughout the seasons. Our grandparents valued it because it could be harvested again and again. Cut the leaves, and they'd grow back. The deep green leaves were packed with vitamins A, K, and iron, while the colorful stems were pickled, sautéed, or added to soups. When other crops failed, Swiss chard stood firm, thriving in rocky soil and harsh conditions. It was an easy way to get nutrients without spending a dime, and families who grew it never had to go without greens. But fresh greens weren't enough to survive tough winters. People needed something that could be stored for months, ensuring they had food when the fields were frozen and gardens were long gone. Storage onions. Onions weren't just a seasoning during the Great Depression, they were a necessity. Families relied on them because they lasted for months in root cellars, providing flavor and nutrition when fresh vegetables were scarce. A sack of onions could transform even the blandest meal into something more satisfying. Onions added depth to thin soups, bulked up small portions of meat, and made simple bread and onion sandwiches a staple in struggling households. Caramelized onion spreads even became a Depression-era delicacy when butter and jam were out of reach. Our grandparents knew that properly cured onions could last all winter, making them a critical survival crop. While onions stored well, they weren't the only overlooked vegetables that could survive the winter. Some roots remained hidden underground, safe from frost and pests, ready to be dug up whenever they were needed. Chinese artichokes. Small, knobby, and often overlooked, Chinese artichokes were a secret survival crop during the 1930s. These hardy little tubers thrived in poor soil and came back year after year without needing replanting. Our grandparents valued them for their reliability and resilience. Once planted, they provided food indefinitely. Unlike potatoes, which required careful storage, Chinese artichokes could be left in the ground all winter, ready to be harvested at any time. Their crisp, nutty flavor made them perfect for stir-fries, soups, or pickling. Easy to grow and nearly impossible to kill, they were a fail-proof crop that ensured no one went hungry. Some vegetables were easy to store, but others were meant to be transformed, cooked, mashed, or even turned into flour to stretch meals further than anyone thought possible. Rutabaga. Rutabagas were one of the best survival crops of the Great Depression. A cross between a turnip and a cabbage, this dense, starchy root could withstand the cold, thriving in poor soil and harsh winters. When potatoes were scarce, rutabagas filled the gap, offering a cheap and filling substitute. They could be mashed, roasted, or turned into stews, making them a versatile food source. Some families even used rutabaga flour to bake bread when wheat was too expensive. The best part? Rutabagas stored incredibly well. Kept in a root cellar or buried in sand, they could last for months without refrigeration. For families struggling to stretch every meal, they were a game changer. Survival wasn't just about food. It was about making food last. And some vegetables weren't just eaten fresh. They were preserved, fermented, and stored to get families through the hardest months of the year. Ground cherries. Sweetness was a rare luxury in the Great Depression, but for those who knew where to look, ground cherries offered a hidden treat. Wrapped in delicate, papery husks, these small golden fruits grew wild in fields, ditches, and neglected gardens, often mistaken for weeds. Our grandparents picked them eagerly, using them to make jams, pies, and preserves when sugar was scarce. Unlike berries that spoiled quickly, ground cherries stored well for weeks, their husks keeping them fresh longer than most fruits. Packed with vitamin C, they helped ward off illness when produce was hard to find. Easy to grow and thriving in poor soil, they were one of the few Depression-era crops that felt like a luxury in hard times. But not everything grown during the Depression was sweet. Some crops were essential for survival, packed with protein and meant to last all year long. Navy beans. If one food could be called the backbone of Great Depression survival, it was navy beans. Cheap, protein-rich, and long-lasting, these small white beans fed countless families through the hardest years of the 1930s. A single bag of dried beans could stretch into dozens of meals, from bean soups to casseroles to baked beans. Our grandparents relied on them because they stored indefinitely, requiring nothing more than a dry place to keep them edible for months. When meat was scarce or too expensive, navy beans became a vital protein source, keeping people strong during long, labor-intensive days. Paired with cornbread, they provided a filling, nutritious meal that cost next to nothing. Food didn't just have to be filling, it had to be resourceful. Some Depression-era families found a way to replace even coffee using a simple plant that grew in fields and gardens alike: chicory root. Coffee was a luxury few could afford in the Great Depression, but our grandparents found an alternative: chicory root. When roasted and ground, chicory produced a rich, earthy drink that closely mimicked coffee, keeping people warm and comforted when real coffee was out of reach. Families dug up the bitter, knobby roots, dried them, and roasted them until dark and fragrant. Not only was chicory coffee caffeine-free, but it was also believed to aid digestion and support liver health, a hidden benefit in hard times. Some people even mixed it with what little coffee they could afford, stretching their supply to last longer. But Depression-era meals weren't just about replacing luxuries. They were about finding hearty vegetables that could survive winter's brutal grip. And few crops were as valuable in the cold as this long, sweet root. Parsnips. Cold weather destroyed many crops, but parsnips only got sweeter after a frost. That made them a perfect survival food in the 1930s. Our grandparents knew that, unlike other vegetables that had to be picked before winter, parsnips could be left in the ground for months, ensuring a fresh food supply long after the last harvest. High in fiber, vitamin C, and potassium, they were mashed, roasted, or added to stews, providing warmth and nourishment in the coldest months. Their natural sweetness meant that they could even be used in place of sugar, a rare commodity during the Depression. Unlike potatoes, which required careful storage, parsnips could be pulled from the frozen soil whenever needed. But when it came to stretching meals and making food last, few things were as critical as a crop that could be dried, ground, and stored for an entire year. Field corn. Sweet corn was a treat, but field corn was survival. Unlike fresh corn, field corn was dried, stored, and ground into flour, meal, and grits, making it a staple food for families during the Great Depression. It could be turned into cornbread, tortillas, grits, or mush, feeding families long after the growing season ended. Since wheat flour was expensive, many relied on cornmeal for baking. Field corn could also be cracked into feed for livestock, ensuring chickens and pigs survived lean times too. Our grandparents knew that a good corn harvest meant they could eat all winter. Even the husks weren't wasted. Some used them for making mattresses or stuffing pillows when fabric was too expensive. Hamburg rooted parsley. Parsley is often seen as a garnish today, but during the Great Depression, Hamburg rooted parsley was a forgotten survival food. Unlike regular parsley, this variety grew a thick, edible root that was highly nutritious and could be stored like carrots or parsnips. Our grandparents boiled, roasted, or mashed it, making soups heartier when meat was scarce. The mild, nutty flavor helped stretch thin meals without overpowering other ingredients. Even the tops weren't wasted. Parsley greens were rich in vitamins and added a burst of flavor when spices were too expensive. Because it thrived in poor soil and cold weather, it was an easy, low-maintenance crop for struggling families. Those who grew Hamburg-rooted parsley had a dual-purpose plant that provided both leafy greens and a starchy root. But not all survival foods were leafy or starchy. Some were tiny, hidden underground, and packed with energy, waiting to be unearthed. Chufa, tiger nuts. Tiny but powerful, chufa or tiger nuts were an energy-packed survival food during the Great Depression. Despite the name, they aren't nuts at all. They're small, tuberous roots that grow underground like peanuts. Our grandparents valued chufa for its high-calorie content and natural sweetness, which made it an excellent substitute for grains when flour was too expensive. These nutrient-dense tubers could be eaten raw, roasted, or ground into flour to make bread and porridge. Some families even soaked them in water to make a milk substitute when dairy was out of reach. Since they thrived in sandy, poor soil with little water, chufa was an ideal crop for hard times, producing food when other plants failed. Some crops were tiny, yet powerful, while others were massive, growing into behemoths that could feed entire families and livestock alike. Mangel wurzel. Mangel wurzel was the giant of Depression-era gardens. Originally grown as livestock feed, It became a crucial food source for struggling families in the 1930s. This enormous root vegetable, a cousin of the beet, could grow as large as a football, meaning just a few could feed an entire household for weeks. It was versatile, boiled like potatoes, mashed, or even fermented for long-term storage. The leaves were edible too, similar to Swiss chard, providing valuable nutrients when other greens were unavailable. Mangel wurzel thrived in poor soil and cold weather, making it one of the most reliable crops in desperate times. Because it was grown primarily as animal feed, it was often overlooked as human food, but those who knew its value never went hungry. Now, while mangel wurzel was the giant of the garden, there was another root vegetable that brought something completely different to the table, a taste that reminded people of better times. Salsify. At first glance, salsify looked like an ordinary root, but inside it held a hidden surprise. When cooked, it had a delicate oyster-like flavor, which is why it was often called oyster plant. In the Great Depression, when fresh seafood was out of reach, salsify provided a taste of luxury in a time of hardship. It thrived in cold weather, making it a dependable crop long after other vegetables had withered. Families boiled or mashed it like potatoes, adding richness to soups and stews. It was also easy to store. Salsify could be left in the ground all winter and harvested whenever needed, making it a perfect survival food. Some vegetables were delicate in flavor, mimicking seafood, but others were hearty, packed with protein, and capable of sustaining an entire family through the toughest winters. Even when times were hardest, there were plants that kept on giving year after year without the need for replanting, offering fresh greens even when everything else failed. One of them had a name that sounded royal, but to struggling families, it was simply a gift from the earth. Good King Henry. Good King Henry was a forgotten gem of the Great Depression, a wild green that grew like a weed but provided valuable food when other crops failed. Unlike lettuce or spinach, which had short growing seasons, this hardy perennial produced nutritious leaves for months, supplying families with a reliable source of vitamins A and C, iron, and calcium. Our grandparents harvested the young shoots in spring, cooking them like asparagus, while the mature leaves were boiled or sautéed like spinach. Since it required no replanting, Good King Henry was a low-maintenance survival crop that thrived in poor soil. It was a secret weapon for those who understood its value, offering food when gardens were bare. While fresh greens were important, families also needed a crop that provided protein, stored well, and could be used in countless meals, one that became a dietary staple of the Great Depression. Field peas. Field peas were one of the most important survival foods of the 1930s. Unlike delicate garden peas, these hardy legumes were grown for long-term storage, ensuring families had food well after the growing season ended. Our grandparents relied on dried field peas because they were rich in protein and fiber, making them an excellent meat substitute when money was tight. When soaked and cooked, they became the base for hearty soups, stews, and casseroles, stretching meals further than almost any other ingredient. Farmers also grew them as a dual-purpose crop, not only for food, but to improve soil health, making them an essential part of Depression-era farming. With a sack of dried peas in the pantry, a family knew they had something to eat all winter long. But while field peas provided protein for survival, some crops were grown for an entirely different reason: to replace what people missed the most in times of hardship. For more contents like this, click here to subscribe.